right, everybody. Welcome to the Dissecting Fiction podcast. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Cutlick.
And today we're going to be talking about Netflix's Castlevania series.
Which is having its third season. Some promos have come out about it already, which are pretty exciting.
Yeah, it'll be out in early March.
So we're here to talk about how difficult this was to make, just because of Konami being Konami.
Yeah, so the story on this actually starts back in March of 2007. Frederator Studios had acquired the rights to do an animated adaptation of Castlevania 3, which did not happen, but was to be written by Warren Ellis, and that script was completed.
It was completed, and then a lot of that survived into the Netflix series, or at least parts of it.
He dropped Grant Dynasty. That sounds more like fancy. Grant Dynasty.
Sounds like a porn star name.
I don't think I've ever seen it actually said. So he dropped one character, but it made a lot of sense that Castlevania 3 would be the one to adapt because you get a Belmont who can go a-whipping. You get a female protagonist in Sypha, and you get Alucard, who for my generation is sort of the main character of Castlevania because Symphony of the Night was like the biggest one.
Yeah, me too. I played more of Dawn of Sorrow, which had like the grandson of somebody in Dracula's family. I don't even remember his name. At that point, Castlevania was shifting characters pretty often.
Yeah, and still does. I mean, that was that sort of old Konami mentality of making sure things are kind of complicated and fresh.
For no reason.
So he has this script running around, and then around 2012, it was approached to do a live-action version of it that would be somewhat low budget and kind of like Underworld. Adi Shankar, who ends up producing the show, turned them down because he didn't want to do something that was too far off from the original source material. Shankar's kind of an interesting figure in the last decade or so.
He did the Power Rangers weird, gritty version.
Yeah, which I thought was terrible. I'll just come out and say it. I thought that was the lamest, interpretation I've ever seen.
The one time. But then it got immediately copyright strike by Toei because Japanese companies are just brutal about the copyright.
It's because the laws are so loose there that anything they can go after, they have to.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't understand this here. A little bit of copyright law education. If you don't defend your copyright, you can lose it. A lot of people don't understand that. They always act like companies are attacking small publishers and stuff. They're not. They have to defend the copyright if they want to keep it.
I mean, it happened with the Sonic comics.
It's true. A few years later, they get approached. I don't know if Netflix approached them or if they approached Netflix. I couldn't really find a solid information on that. They did go in, and Powerhouse Animation Studios, along with Shankar, and I think along with Frederator Studios still producing, came in and wanted to make this as a show for Netflix.
This is where Netflix was trying to build out their library because they were pretty aware that all the studios were going to pull out their licensing. So they were trying to build their own original library. And this was kind of spearheading their adult animation wing outside of BoJack Horseman, which is just Depression, the show.
It also is significant to mention here that when writing that script, Ellis actually wrote 3 scripts. He had thought that it would end up like a direct-to-video trilogy, as he thought you couldn't really cover enough ground in one to really tell the whole story. We're going to talk about that a little bit as we go forward. What's cool, and this is a pretty big exception, is Netflix was happy with the scripts that were written 2007 and were basically ready to go ahead on that. What that leads to is Castlevania Season 1, which is very obviously not a season of a TV show and a movie broken into 4 episodes.
Yeah, but you can see where they put in the episode chunks too, because it is a very short season, but it's a really, really tight season. Even the second season is really tight, but what impressed me the most about Castlevania 1, I wrote an article about it on Dissecting Fiction, is they spend a lot of time trying to characterize Dracula and his family and his feelings.
Which is what Ellis was aiming to do. It's part of the reason he dropped Grant, is he felt like the character didn't really fit anything that was going on, and if he was going to flesh out these characters more, it would just be a distraction.
He was absolutely right to do that because, this town is not a sea town. It's not near any ports. So even, in the mythology of the show, he would not have fit in with anything.
one of like the biggest strengths is that it is the focus on the characters in season 1. You also find out very quickly in season 1 that they are willing to be exceptionally violent. And it's funny, I remembered it being violent, but I rewatched right before, we sat down to do this pretty much, and I was just utterly blown away by how violent that show gets.
Like, babies get killed and eaten.
Yeah, on screen. We're not talking, like, you see, like, the bodies of children in the streets. It's gory.
It has a lot of Berserk vibes, which is great, but, like, it is extremely gory and, like, I don't want to say cruel, but, like, just violent. But the way Powerhouse Animation, like, draws those scenes and animates them, it doesn't, like, feel all that overboard. I mean, it is in the context of the show, but, like, they do such a good job of, like, set design, all these action scenes, the way they even draw the characters, it just doesn't feel, like, overwhelming.
Right, no, it's done very well. There's definitely, like, an influence of the later Castlevania art on it, past Castlevania 3, though it is, in large part, still an adaptation of Castlevania 3. I think if there is any weaknesses in Season 1, it's two things. Sometimes dialogue comes off a little stiff, and I have a feeling that has to do with Ellis's comic book background, and it sounds weird to say, especially because I'm such a big fan of his work in comics, but where you might be able to get like an inner monologue in like a text box or something, the characters are all saying these things out loud, like when they're alone, and sometimes it's just like an exceptional amount of exposition in a scene that like not much is going on in.
I also think it's just like, he's working in such a small time frame. He's also just being like, I have to just get this information out there. I don't really care how it works. The storyboarders can figure it out. And then the storyboarders did it, and they're like, this is fine just as.
Yeah, and I agree to that to a certain extent. Like, I certainly still enjoyed it very much. My other major criticism on Season 1 is that Season 1 isn't a season. It's like, it's a pilot movie. My problem with that is nothing's really accomplished at the end of Season 1.
Yeah, they just wake up Alucard and they fight the golem in the basement.
Yeah, and then it's like, okay, let's go on to Season 2. Like, it's almost literally the ending is like, all right, more to do now.
I can't wait for the next day, and they look at the sunrise and everything.
Because, we don't have to get too much into, like, the specifics of the plot, but the basic plot is, like, Dracula has decided to destroy the world.
Yeah, but, like, the reasons why he destroys it, I think, make it very interesting. And I do like the subtle commentaries on, like, religion. I don't even want to say the commentary because it's just, like, priests are fucking assholes. So he has, like, a demon bust in and eat the priest, which I thought was the coolest scene.
It is interesting, though, because we'll get to this in a second. There's no reason not to talk about it, because, like I said, like, Season 1 ends where Dracula is still about to destroy the world. Like, nothing's really been accomplished in Season 1 except for lots of character development, which is, like I said, okay. When we get into Season 2, the first thing you get in Season 2 is we go back to the impetus of all this is Dracula's wife, who was human, is killed for witchcraft, which she is not performing. She is simply using science that she learned from Dracula's library to help people. But it killed me in that first episode because she turns, like, they're coming after her and telling her she's a witch, and she's like, I'm not a witch, but if you come after me, my husband's gonna kill everyone. I'm like, you kind of sound like a witch. like if I was just, like, not involved in this, and this woman just told me, like, if you arrest me, you're all gonna die, I'm like, you're a witch!
Yeah, it's like, my husband, Dracula, the vampire, is going to kill you all.
So, like, I actually kind of appreciated that at the beginning of Season 2, where, like, Season 1, like, everyone who's involved in, like, the church is, like, a complete asshole. And then the first thing that happens in Season 2, you're kind of like, all right, well, you can kind of see why maybe some of them would think, all right, let's kill her.
I mean, but it is directed by, like, these very, like, corrupt priests that want to control people.
Right.
But, like,
right, but you gotta have a little sympathy for the people who are a little lower down, who might have, like, been okay with it, because, like, she said, you're all gonna die.
And she said a vampire was going to kill me.
Yeah, she just told us a vampire was gonna murder all of us. Season 2 is where a lot of the plot plays out, I think, extremely effectively. It is fast-paced. You get at least one really good action sequence in every episode. It's still haunted a little bit by that, like, necessary exposition, but you really can let it go. And the funny stuff is actually funny. The jokes land.
Yeah, this is where they hammer out the dynamics really well, where Alucard's kind of like an emo kid, and you have like the Belmont being like a drunk and everything.
They also spend a lot of time developing Dracula's forces, too, which is cool. Because you really did get most of your development on the characters, the heroes, in the first season. This one, you get a lot of time with the vampires and their 2 human buddies.
Buddies is a strong word.
Yeah, buddies. I like buddies. Well, they were Dracula's buddies.
They're kind of servants. They're kind of slaves.
Not at first. At first, they got a little... things get worse as this goes on. What I thought was interesting, and this is just a structural thing, and but I couldn't help but notice it. It didn't feel like it was written out as episodes. It felt like it was written out as segments, and they just made all of it together and then broke. They figured out where 25 minutes was. And that's, whatever the closest segment ending was is what they ended on. Because there's this weird thing where it blacks out and in, throughout every episode. And,
I didn't.
You're watching it. I'm watching it trying not to pay attention to the clock or anything. I'm watching it straight through. And, every time I'm like, oh, is the episode end? No, okay. And then inevitably, eventually, just one fades out and then it's the end of the episode. And it never feels like an ending to the episode. It just feels like the ending of that segment.
Well, what I noticed is where, like you said, it has an action scene every episode, but it also feels like the action scene is just kind of there to break up the exposition and the banter.
It could be the first scene. It could be the last scene. It could be 2 scenes in.
The one scene I remember really clearly is where the vampire barbarian just goes into a town for no reason and starts killing people. Then he goes back and just chills with Dracula for the rest of the episode. And there's a lot of exposition where Dracula's explaining about the science. And vampires barbarian's oh, I don't really care. I just want to get drunk. I just want to go kill. I do really like the 2 servants Dracula has because I think they contrast each other really well. And they show Dracula's weird humanity and the bitterness that has been born in him after his wife died and his kind of suicidal tendencies that they show at the end.
They do a lot of cool work with them. It's Hector and Isaac?
Yeah, Hector and Isaac.
Hector and Isaac are 2 humans aligned with Dracula. There's also a lot of development with the other... I shouldn't say all of the other. 2 of the other generals who are vampires you get a lot of time with. And you start to see really perspectives on Dracula. The vampires seem to pretty much think that this is stupid and he shouldn't care so much about a human. The humans hate humanity, but get why he's mad at humanity, so want to help him.
Well, the vampires are they're insects. Why are you antagonizing them? Especially with Camilla, who is kind of like a white queen. She's kind of like an Emma Frost in the show, where she's constantly harassing Dracula for making stupid plans, and Dracula just doesn't care. But I do like how they characterize Hector and Isaac in that with those 2 characters, you see the different ways they hate humanity. Hector kind of hates them because they're mean to animals, which is a very childish way. He doesn't really get the nuances of why human society is bad and cruel. Well, Isaac was born a slave. He was born under this incredibly oppressive system. And he hates humans because they treated him extremely badly. And Dracula was the only one that ever showed him kindness.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. Hector is described literally by Camilla as a child. But they're both, and this should be explained if you haven't watched. This is a weird thing because we're describing a lot of the plot. And I'm assuming people have actually seen the show. But if you haven't, Hector and Isaac are also forge masters, which is described as...
necromancers.
Yeah, they're basically necromancers who can resurrect any dead people into monsters who I guess they're actually being possessed by the monster, which is the implication, but it's a whole thing. But they're important. Dracula needs them to build his army. And so Dracula's actually pretty good to them.
Yeah, but he's good at them not just because they're useful, but because he does actually like them. Because he doesn't treat the vampires the same way. But he also doesn't, treat the vampires nicely. He kind of begrudgingly gives them the shitty rooms in his castle, while, Hector and Isaac get really nice rooms and a forge and everything.
Yeah, I feel like it has a lot to do with, the respect Dracula has for them. Is, the vampires are, immortals like him who are complaining about a lot of shit. And, Hector and Isaac, even though, you would, perceive their motivations as somewhat evil, he sees them as motivated. He sees them as, real, allies. And so he gives them a lot of respect that the vampires don't. As you're saying, a lot of violence. Vampires die, humans die.
But the way they do the action scenes is, incredible. Especially, that ending siege on Dracula's castle. That fight in the lobby is just incredible. Like, the way they figured out all those, like, punches, not even punches, but the way the weapons are thrown. Like, Sybil does that really cool thing with the ice where she cuts the vampire in half.
One of the things Ellis is really good at when he writes for animation, and this is something that popped up in G.I. Joe Resolute, which disappointingly never turned into a series, even though it was obviously set up to do so. He's very, very good at balancing, okay, I gotta make this accessible. He's good at balancing keeping what makes the characters work and adding in, like, that fun aspect. Like, he gets how to do the action and how to write it. And the Dietz, who directed most of the episodes in this, are very good at, like, translating his scripts, I think.
Yeah, because when you're writing a script, you can't, like, physically type out all that action because they just take up too much. It depends on which company you're working for, but, like, I'd imagine Ellis left a lot to the storyboarders to actually plot all that. The action is incredible in Castlevania, but it's also permeated by, like, a real, like, sense of characters, the way characters fight. It reminds me a lot of Avatar: The Last Airbender, where, like, everybody has a distinct fighting style based on their personality. It's not them, like, running in and doing their own thing.
And I think what's cool is Alice, by his own admission, didn't really know the story and went back and researched it and kind of ended up at, like, a really valid version. And I remember hearing almost the exact same thing with Resolute, that, like, he wasn't a big G.I. Joe fan, but, like, he's one of those guys who can look at something and get why it works and then derive it down into a really pointed version of it. And that's what he did here, too.
Well, it's weird when you're adapting, like, Castlevania, because there is, like, a complicated story in the same way Resident Evil has a story, but the story is not, like, the appealing part of either of those franchises. It's more of, like, how you're interacting with the monsters, and I think that's the interesting part about this Castlevania, because there's not a whole lot of monsters. I mean, you have, like, zombie Aries and things like that, but it's more about, like, how Alice created these characters.
I think Season 2 kind of changes that. I think Season 2 starts to get pretty monster heavy, but you've already established who the characters are, which is what makes it work. What I think is super impressive is, and, spoilers, the season ends essentially with the death of Dracula.
Yeah, but it ends in a very sad way, because it's like Dracula's beating up his son, and then he looks up and he's in his son room and he has his son bloodied on the floor, and he's like, what the fuck have I become? And he willingly kills himself. I mean, doesn't, like, jump out the window.
Allows himself to
be killed. Yeah.
That's the type of stuff you can build when you take the time to flesh out your characters, which often animated series don't, or don't as effectively, I should say. Or it takes longer, which I think is interesting. Where, I'll wage that criticism that Season 1 doesn't feel like a real season, but you know what? They get a lot done. And it helps Season 2, because Season 2 feels like a rocket ship. Like, Season 2 is just stuff happening, and you understand all of it because they are taking those character moments for everyone.
Yeah, there is stuff happening, but it also feels like it's very well paced, because it's like slow scene, fast scene, slow scene, fast scene. It's very, like, methodical about it. It's not just like, we made a Batman episode and we talked a lot about Christopher Nolan and being like him being very frantic. Here, there's a lot of, like, time for characters to talk and, like, talk about their feelings and things like that.
And ultimately, it makes all of what could be really goofy action have a lot of weight. So, Season 2 ends, like we said, with the death of Dracula, but there's another episode on top of it. We find out kind of the 4 big things that are going to go on for Season 3. One is Alucard now lives in Dracula's castle, which is above the Belmont estate, which has been all left to him to caretake. Which is kind of cool. It's a little, like, superhero-y.
It's a nod to, like, the Castlevania games, too, because more often than not, the castle appears over Belmont just to take revenge, or some other weird anomaly shit that happens.
We have Trevor Belmont and Sypha go off to be adventurers, essentially. Which is
make their own D&D party.
Basically, I feel like that might be where it's going. We'll get into that in a second. You have Camilla now in possession of Hector, and, like, in possession, he's now not being treated well at all.
He's, like, literally on a dog leash and everything.
Because there is a separate plot in there of her betrayal of Dracula, which leads to a lot of really cool stuff.
Yeah, she kind of seduces him. She tries to seduce Isaac, but Isaac's not having any of it. But Hector's, like, isolated enough that it works on him.
Then you have Isaac, who is, like, literally saved by Dracula before everything goes to shit. Thrown through a portal, ends up in the desert, and then you find out is still pretty bitter and is now creating, like, an army of the undead of his own with his abilities. So, where you would think the death of Dracula would be the end of Castlevania, they've actually set this up to be really cool.
They set up like somebody trying to take over like the Dracula estate, because more than just like Dracula being a very powerful vampire, he's also like a very well-researched vampire. There's a lot of scenes about them like
a well-researched vampire
having all these weird machines. Like his castle literally teleports and they don't know how. He has libraries of all these magics, and like there's a lot more to Dracula than just the person or this vampire.
Right. They talk about this idea of like the true magic, and the idea that, you know, all these ancient civilizations had all this knowledge that was like lost in the Dark Ages, but Dracula still has it and would be able to help the world in such a bit, or hurt the world however he pleased. And so the acquisition of this knowledge, in addition to the knowledge that the Belmonts have, would be incredibly dangerous in the wrong hands.
Yeah, you have like all of this book on necromancy, then all the counter magic on that, and Camilla's now posed to like fill in the vacuum now, because now she has her own Forge Master, and she implies there's a lot of other vampires that did not join Dracula, and these were just like the very old vampires that joined Dracula.
He didn't request everyone join him either, was something they made a point of.
Yeah, it was just people that were willingly able to show up, and it seemed like it was a lot of his old friends and things like that.
So we don't know much about Season 3. We've both been intentionally sort of staying away from it. There is a trailer which doesn't really show you too much. You get to see some quick shots of fight scenes. But I happened to be scrolling through the cast and noticed that there is a character called the Captain, which may well be seafaring. As now our main heroes have gone on a venture and out of Eastern Europe, potentially. Do you think this is where they're going to introduce Grant? I think it might be.
They might. It might be a version of Grant. I would like it to not be like a drunken pirate, because we already kind of have that in the Belmont. Because we already have
well,
one
he's over
drunk.
that now. He's good now.
He's still a drunk.
He's still drunk. Once a drunk, always a drunk.
That's his part of his character. Like, he might not be drinking that excessively, but like that's still a part of his appeal, is that he's a sloppy guy. I don't know how well a perfect adaptation of Grant Dynasty would be, but I do feel like they've probably introduced him. They might make him like a thief or something.
It would be a nice nod at this point, especially because, you know, if the reason he was removed is because he was just kind of getting in the way of the plot. If now your plot can kind of be whatever you want it to be. So
now I assume it's probably going to be a Grant Dynasty, because we do have the ability to go on seas and everything. Since we're moving away from the more isolated location of Wallachia, which is all an inland like allegory for Transylvania and everything. Especially now that Camilla's now posed to take over the vampire, like, I guess, dynasty, or
oh, at
empire?
least she's attempting to, is the idea, I guess, to be the most powerful vampire. I think what's really interesting about this, too, is the time in Konami history it's occurring in, is we have this incredibly well-distributed, well-received series based around their games when they don't really seem to care too much about making games.
Yeah, they don't have a Castlevania game in the works outside of like a slot machine. Like Konami's in a really weird position where like the biggest game right now is like Yu-Gi-Oh, like the mobile game and the card game, and they're not making any other games outside of gambling machines.
Yeah, there's a rumor that they're doing a Silent Hill right now, and maybe the success of this is kind of pushing them back towards story-driven things.
I don't think they give a shit about this, and that's why they're free to do whatever.
It's possible, too. But I couldn't help but think how cool it would be to get Warren Ellis to write a Metal Gear show. Like,
I feel
think about what he did with this. Like, think about, like, if you made every season a game, like, and you gave that to him, he'd make it make sense, I believe.
I feel like if that happened, Kojima would, like, drive his car through like a studio and be like, you didn't hire me, the game director, I built my entire life to make movies, and you give my movie away to somebody else?
That's true. The lack of involvement from Kojima would be bizarre, but
it might be better for it too.
It might be a little better for it, let's be honest. Like, because you want it to be like
focus.
Comprehensible. And I feel like that's the kind of thing like Ellis could do. If Ellis got his hands on like those characters and just looked and be like, all right, well, that makes sense. I'm not going to talk about any of this. Like, you could do like Metal Gear 1, you could do Metal Gear 2, and then go to Metal Gear Solid to Season 3.
Yeah, Metal Gear 1 and 2 and Solid make somewhat makes sense generally. It's just when you get to like 2 and 3, well, 2 and 4, where it's like completely falls apart.
Right. I think you could do a streamlined version of 4 as well if you wanted. Yeah. But I think, like, it just got into my head. I'm like, it'd be so cool to have, like, that violent of a Metal Gear cartoon.
Metal Gear's never been bloody, but I think Warren Ellis would be able to really get down to the nitty-gritty of, like, this is how, like, a soldier would fight people, especially when they're trying not to get caught. And he's just, like, snapping necks and doing, like, very James Bond stuff.
And he would take the time to develop the characters, which, to be as much as I love Metal Gear, and I love Metal Gear, and I've played all of them, like, you still kind of never really know who Snake is. Like, it's very, like, surfacey character. He's very, like, Western, like, tough guy.
It's kind of like a Clint Eastwood.
And you get a lot of information about Big Boss, but, like, I don't know. I still don't feel like I know anyone's personalities.
I know Otacon's personality because all he talks about is anime and robots.
That's true.
But, like, Snake only talks about, like, whiskey and cigars, and a lot of other times it's people explaining why they like movies.
But that's, like, a good example of, like, how, like, a great game doesn't necessarily translate well, and how good of a job Ellis did here of translating Castlevania into something that is, like, digestible.
Yeah, I think he just took, like, the general idea, then he was able to see, like, well, why would this character do this? Why would this character do that? Oh, there's all these Belmonts, let's make them a family of vampire hunters or something.
Well, I mean, a lot of that was in there. It's very much, like I said, very similar to, like, Resolute, where he got to, like, the real intrinsic versions of the characters and then put them in, like, a cool situation.
But I'm very looking forward to Season 3. Castlevania has been brilliant. I always look forward to Castlevania and Venture Brothers, but Venture Brothers never seems to come out.
Yeah, I'm excited about it, too, and the good thing is you can probably watch it in one day.
Yeah, it's probably going to be like 8 episodes. Yeah,
it's like the season 1 Blu-ray is like one disc. It's like, okay, it's like, because this is a movie. But what do you guys think about Castlevania? What do you think about Netflix maybe doing some similar series for other video game properties, maybe with as good of writers as we got here?
Well, they're doing in Transformers. I know that.
That trailer looked cool too. But yeah, let us know what you guys think. If there's anything you think that Netflix could tackle. They've had a pretty good track record with these animated series, Voltron, Castlevania.
Well, Voltron was good for, like, the first 2 seasons, and then, like, the writer's room, like, exploded. There's a whole, like, insane theories about them literally, like, painting over characters and things like that.
That might have to be an episode in itself. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like it, share it, 5-star it, click that bell, do all the things that you would do to make sure that you get to hear our other stuff. And you know what? I'm thinking, even if you didn't like it, please do that.
Yeah, please.
Follow us on pretty much all relevant social media. Just type in Dissecting Fiction. Most of the time we're going to pop up. That's really it for this one, I think. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Cutlick.
And thanks for listening.